welcome back to the podcast. I'm Adrian Lloyd, and this is just my stupid opinion. And we're going to be covering a few range of topics today. We're going to cover politics. We're going to cover Milo's free speech rally, which seems to have fallen apart. And we're also going to cover Trump, and that's actually where we're going to start off today. I got two stories coming at you today. The first one has to do with Trump taking on the NFL, and the next one is Trump when he gave his speech at the UN. So in order to get into what's happening with Trump and the NFL, we're going back just a little bit. As many of you, especially any of you who are sports fans, are probably aware right now of Colin Kaepernick's kneeling during the national anthem protest that has been going on. Colin Kaepernick started this because he felt that the black community was being disproportionately targeted by white police officers, so it was a protest because he felt that America was not doing anything to help in this, so it was his protest in order to show how unhappy he is with the country. And this, of course, was divisive. Something like this is always very divisive between the left and the right. People on the left were supporting him, telling him that his stance was for a good cause and then he should keep it up regardless of the hate. And then we have the people on the right who are saying that Colin Kaepernick hates the country and everybody who supports him hates America and how disrespectful it is just to the nation, to the flag, to everybody who's fought and died for the country. For me, one thing that kind of makes me a little uneasy in supporting Colin Kaepernick is just some of the people that are supporting him. Someone like Linda Sarsour is supporting him, and I have big problems in the past with things that Linda Sarsour has said and done, such as when she organized the Women's Day March, she encouraged many women that the hijab is an empowering material, empowering piece of clothing. And there's just been a couple other figures I'm not crazy about as well that have shown support for him. He's nothing special from what I can tell. I enjoy football, but I'm not a fan who follows what happens. So I'm not familiar with much of Colin Kaepernick's play, so that's why I have to rely on his average here. But anyway, getting back to Trump on this. So the president descended on Alabama to hold a rally. And in this rally, along with a few other things I talked about, he decided to start taking shots at the NFL for how they're running the game, for how they're handling the situation. Because more players are starting to show their support for Colin Kaepernick, and many are starting to say that they are not going to stand during the national anthem either. That they are going to kneel during the national anthem as well. So, the Donald is not happy about this. And as he always does, he took to Twitter to let everybody know how displeased he was with everything. And if you kind of scroll through on it, if you kind of scroll through his Twitter feed, it could be very easy to miss these tweets of him targeting the NFL, because it was just mixed in with different tirades going over hours. Just, a good, you could probably say 8 hours or so in total of just different tweets of him attacking. Starts off by him saying that he's going to Alabama, where he ends up making his big speech. So he's heading to Alabama, and then we end up hearing that John McCain has once again blocked the attempt to repeal Obamacare and replace it with this Trump care, this watered down Obamacare, essentially. So even though it would seem this may have been Republicans' last-ditch attempt to repeal Obamacare, and once again, just like a couple months ago, John McCain stepped in the way and prevented it from going through. So he spends the next couple hours going on a tirade about Obamacare and John McCain, going on more of a tirade, saying he's going that the fact that Steph Curry is hesitating to even come to the White House, being a seasoned champ, that his invitation is withdrawn. That's when he gets into the if the players want the privilege of making millions of dollars in the NFL or other leagues, or he or she should not be allowed to disrespect our great American flag or country and should stand for the national anthem. If you're not, you're fired. Find something else to do. Goes on to praise his wife. Then moves on to talk about Iran firing a ballistic missile test. Takes a few more shots at the Democrats and John McCain, and then takes some more shots at Roger Goodell and the NFL for his response. So this was all mixed in over the course of several hours of just a tirade of tweets coming out of him attacking everyone left, right, and center. But while he's in his rally in Alabama, this clip here is what really set the people off the most. So now Trump's encouraging people to get up and leave and show their protest in order to drop the NFL ratings even more. Whether this will happen will be very interesting to see. Trump's been pretty influential so far, so I could actually see some people being willing to do it. And something like this does cause a bit of a snowball effect. If a few people are willing to leave, there's many more who are more hesitant that will then be more willing to step up and leave as well. So we'll see what ends up happening, and if actually this comes to affect how the NFL is working. I love how he tends to attribute to himself how the fact that the NFL ratings are dropping is probably because people are tuning in to watch what he has to say. I could not imagine people with less time on their hands than to turn off their sports just to tune in and listen what the president is saying all the time. But I think Trump is on to something when he's talking about they're dropping ratings. not so much to do with NFL, but just sports in general. It seems that a lot of politics has gotten into sports these days. I remember a couple years ago there was the performance by Beyonce at the Super Bowl where it was the 50th year of the Black Panthers, and her backup dancers were dressed like the sort of like the members of the Black Panthers back in the 60s. And this caused a big uproar. Everyone was saying it's a political message. Personally, for me, even at the time, even today, I don't think it's that big of a deal. It was the dress she chose or they chose as backup dancers. Probably Beyonce selected them for them. But to me, even today, I don't think this is as big of a deal. Not that much of a political statement. It kind of is, but it's more showing homage rather than anything else, if you ask me. But ever since then, things have really gotten out of control. One of the big things was this past Super Bowl that just happened. A lot of people were pissed off because they found that all the Super Bowl commercials were politicized. There was a time when we used to tune in and watch the Super Bowl for the commercials because they were great commercials that people would spend millions of dollars to make these great, out of these world, hilarious commercials. Everybody loved them. I sometimes have gone online and just Googled, been on YouTube and searched for Super Bowl commercials because they're so funny. But this time it was just about race relations, wage gap, gender problems. These were all the ads being displayed during the Super Bowl. When this is probably the Super Bowl has probably the most viewers probably ever, I think, at one time. It's one of the most popular things on TV ever. Has great ratings, and this is the sort of crap they're going to try and push. So I think this has a lot more to do with actually how politicized everything has become, because ESPN is another organization that is losing money, losing viewers, and this too has to do with whenever you tune in, it seems that they're always not talking about sports, but talking about what's going on in the culture these days. And that's not what people tune in for. That's not what they're there for. People are there to talk about which team is most likely going to win. What does the other team need to do to pull back? How is this player going to change the game? They're there to talk about stats. They're there to talk about situations. They're not there to talk about culture, society, politics, but that's what it's become these days. So people don't want that in their sports anymore. A lot of sports fans just want to watch their sports and they don't give a shit about politics. Some do give a shit about politics, but they still don't want it mixed in with their sports. So that is one place where I thought Trump made some sense. As for the rest of it, I thought he was just being a little bit ridiculous. Although, ever since this, many teams have come together and rallied to push back against what Trump has said. And the hashtag Take a Knee has been trending on Twitter all day. It was September 23rd, yeah. All day. It was just trending. But yeah, teams like the San Francisco 49ers, of course, that's Kaepernick's team, and the New York Giants have been making statements against Trump. CEO Jed York for the 49ers said, quote, "The callous and offensive comments made by the president are contradictory to what the great country stands for. Our players have exercised their rights as United States citizens in order to spark conversation and action to address social injustice. We will continue to support them in their peaceful pursuit of positive change in the country and around the world." End quote. What we got to remember, though, is these are players' jobs. I kind of wonder if the regular Joe could do this sort of thing in their own workplace and get away with it. But in this case, they're supporting their players to make political statements and support social justice. Even though they say address social injustice, then they're supporting social justice. Well, again, this is not why your players are there. Your players are there to show entertainment for your fans who pay good money for tickets every year. Many of those people buy season tickets. They're not curious on what your political statement is. They want to know how hard you can hit the other team. And also, Roger Goodell, the commissioner for the NFL, had to comment on this. And I mentioned earlier, Trump already made shots at him. But what Roger Goodell said is, quote, divisive comments like these demonstrated are an unfortunate lack of respect for the NFL, our great game and all that our players, and a failure to understand the overwhelming force for good our club and players represent in our communities, end quote. In response to this, Trump ended up tweeting out that saying, Roger Goodell of NFL just put out a statement trying to justify the total disrespect certain players show in our country. Tell them to stand. It's funny how we live in an age where we get all of our information from the president through 140 character these days. There was a time when we had to have press conferences, and there was a time when the president would address the nation, and it would be on every channel, forcing you to watch it or listen to it if you had the radio on or the TV on. Now, just anytime he feels a little pissed off, the president can just put out a fucking tweet. This is a funny time we live in. But some of the other teams showing support for Colin Kaepernick and others doing this protest include the Green Bay Packers, the Miami Dolphins, I already stated the New York Giants, the Buffalo Bills. So I guess it's kind of important to mention that Trump never actually mentioned Colin Kaepernick by name, but it's pretty obvious looking at this who he's making reference to. Well, Kaepernick started this all off, and in case I didn't mention it already, it began in August 2016 when Kaepernick began doing this, and he hasn't been on a team. And he's not on a team right now. He opted out of his contract during the offseason with the 49ers, and no team has been willing to sign him on. And this is some of the problem at least people on the right have with what some of the left are doing. People are saying that Colin Kaepernick deserves a job just because he's kneeling during the anthem. And that's not true. Because even if he's making a good statement, well, if they want to support him and say keep up your statement, sure. But when in the world of sports, everything is about your stats, how well you do, how many touchdowns you get, how many interceptions, how many yards you make. So this sort of political protest is really kind of dumb and unnecessary. That being said, I thought it would be kind of important to point out that no crazy Trump moment would be complete until Alex Jones has to put in his 2 cents. And of course, for Alex Jones, it's not just him showing support for Trump or for Trump pushing back against PC culture and that. No. He's got to link it to a much higher authority problem. And of course, he goes on one of his tirades, as he always does. I got a clip for you right here we can take a look through.
There really aren't words to describe how powerful and how important this simple statement is that you are about to see.
Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired. He's fired!
Now, the NFL, the Players Association groups, all of them are flipping out right now because they're part of the Hollywood, part of the globalist, part of the big media elite that's been bullying and pissing on the American people and telling everybody they're racist and telling everybody they're bad and telling them to accept globalism and socialism and communism and to just give up all our rights or we're going to bully you and call you racist, like Tom Brokaw's called me with no evidence. And people, not just white folks, but everybody I know is just sick of it. They know it's political bullying. It's in the WikiLeaks. So why is this so important? Why am I so excited? Because the power of the boycott. It's why every major authoritarian system seeks to get rid of free market, even though they know it creates wealth and invention and is the best system, because it's not good for elites. Look at North Korea, look at Venezuela. They want full control. They don't want you to have choices. They don't want you to have a free market to have power through boycotts or through voting with your dollars. So Trump's saying, you want to bitch and complain and turn every NFL event into a big pity party and claim blacks are more oppressed than they've ever been and all this other crap, when these are some of the most rich and powerful black folks out there, hundreds of millions of dollars, in many cases apiece. This is all George Soros funded, and people are boycotting it, and there's record low ratings and record low attendance. So Trump's pointing out your power, and that's why even Fox News and the NFL commissioner are like, this is terrible, this is disrespectful, hating America and hating the flag and hijacking sporting events that folks just want to tune in and watch for political bullying. That's okay. But the president's saying, hey, owners, it's your company. You don't want people's political speeches during your event that they're paid to go play in, not give their political views? I mean, it's fine to give players $50,000 fines for, doing ridiculous celebrations, they say, but oh my God, put down America, work for George Soros, try to bully the country, try to, pull a spectacle off. Oh no, don't fire them. And Kaepernick, these other idiots are suing. Kaepernick's out of the NFL because he's a loser and had 2 horrible seasons. He's a loser little titty baby. And that's all this stuff is. And so he's saying it's okay to have America. It's okay to have our country. It's okay to love our nation. But they want to teach you to hate your nation. And America is waking up from this. And that's why Trump's statements are so incredibly powerful, is that he's letting you know you have the power to stop watching this. You have the power to leave. They've been using sports to control people since ancient Rome and ancient Greece and ancient Japan. And so I'm against it overall because it becomes a distraction. It becomes what takes up most men's lives instead of being fathers, instead of being politically involved, instead of having quality time with their children and going out camping or tubing or fishing or hunting. It's all just about watching other people, bloated, steroid head, drug addict, spoiled brats. So I say, F the NFL, F the globalist. I'm so glad the thug, punk, Politico chairman of the NFL commissioner, has come out and slapped America in the face and said, we're bad for not wanting to watch them wipe their asses with the American flag every time. And so they just picked a fight with the president and the American people. They're going to lose. Just like mainstream media is collapsing, just like Hollywood's collapsing, just like late night comics are the last best hope of fake media to pull off all this garbage. The NFL has signed its eventual destruction. Thank God. Thank God. The UFC isn't so politically correct. They know what to do. Dana White knows what he's doing. Because I'm not against having some decent sports. Just don't give me your political horse shit. Okay, and beat me over the head of it when I'm sitting around trying to distract myself from all the hard work I've been doing, and I can't even sit down and watch a football game because every break's anti-gun, anti-Christian, anti-family crap. You social engineers crave dominating America? Well, guess what? The sleeping giant's awake now, bitches, and it's over. So everybody start realizing they need us, not the other way around. All these globalists, Hollywood, Rob Reiner, all this trash that wants to say we're all Russians because we want to make America great again and cut taxes and take care of our veterans. Bullshit! You're the globalist. You're the outside threat. You're the traitors. You're the plague. And you're getting your asses kicked politically up and down the street, and you're trying to censor and bully more. That's just going to accelerate the awakening.
So that was a hell of a rant. And let's just go through everything that he blamed inside that rant, because there was a lot. So he started off actually by showing support for boycotts and telling people that they still have a right to boycott. But he's always against boycotting whenever it came to anything to do with Trump or anything he didn't like. As soon as it was anything he had a problem with, well, then boycotting was the worst thing in the world. But now when it's Trump telling everyone to boycott, it's the best thing in the world. He went on to blame the global elite, talk about authoritarian governments, making references to Venezuela and North Korea, ranting against communism and socialism, saying that the NFL owners are working for George Soros, teaching people to hate their own nation, and also blamed the social engineers for all of this. Holy shit. Yeah, somehow everything here has to do, all you have to do is look at what Colin Kaepernick is saying and all these other people are saying. They're saying that they believe they are standing up and, well, I guess no pun intended, but they're standing up to show injustice inside America. So they're doing something to try and show what is wrong with America, to try and make it better in their own point of view. But Alex Jones has gone on to blame them for working for George Soros, global elite, trying to push communism, socialism. Like, don't get me wrong, I've already talked about how politicized everything and everything in the NFL is as well. But in this particular situation, even if this is a political moment for what they're doing, he's saying that they're trying to push communism, socialism, work for the global elite, teaching you to hate your own nation. This is way over the top. I highly doubt that this is what they were trying to push with simply kneeling during the national anthem. Now, he makes some reference about they're stomping on the flag or wiping their ass with the flag, and I guess depending on your point of view, some people would say this, because it is showing some disrespect for your country, although I'm sure in their point of view, they think that it more is showing the problems. It's not showing a disrespect for your country, but it's showing the problems in your country in an effort to better them. That's just Trump being crazy, as always. And then we go on to our second story, and this one has to do with Trump's speech at the UN. So on September 19th, Trump ended up giving a speech at the UN, and the main core of his speech ended up covering about foreign affairs, which makes sense, it's the UN, but more specifically about several key problem nations around the world at the moment. And I gotta say, he was hammering pretty hard, all three of these. So the main summary of Trump's speech had to do with the sovereignty of the independent nations. He spoke a lot about what he had to do for America, but also that he understood that other nations had to leaders, but also said that other nation leaders, he understood that they had to do what was best for their country, and he actually was encouraging it. I don't know if this was him trying to more explain his position and why he's been so pro-America or something, which I don't really know why somebody from their own country would have to explain why they're very pro-country. But it's just not good in this global days. You're supposed to be more open to other nations, your ally nations especially, so this is probably partly due to it. But he goes on to his main points, which he talks about how the world and the UN need to come together in order to confront evil nations. And in this, he ended up singling out North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Venezuela. We'll break them down each one at a time, and then I'll go a little bit into what I think on these situations. But anyway, in terms of North Korea, now this was probably the most entertaining of them all, the most interesting one. Of course, he was making reference a lot to the nuclear tests that have been being done by North Korea recently. I did an episode on it not that long ago, actually, maybe only a few weeks ago, maybe a month by now. But just about how they have finally achieved a nuclear missile as well as ballistic intercontinental missiles that can be used to target nations, even to the extent that they could be able to possibly hit America. But probably, I think the best highlight of the night had to be when we got a clip of it here, but hey, it's when Donald Trump called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man. So let's play the clip.
We must protect our nations, their interests, and their futures. We must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine to the South China Sea. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary.
I thought it was pretty entertaining. Call him Rocket Man, although it's putting a little too lightly the situation. Although Trump came on pretty bluntly in this, so he didn't really hide what his feelings were, so.
No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and oppression of countless more. We were all witness to the regime's deadly abuse when an innocent American college student, Otto Warmbier, was returned to America only to die a few days later. We saw it in the assassination of the dictator's brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles.
But Kim Jong-un can't let a comment like Rocket Man go without responding to it, and he ended up in response calling Trump a dotard. And a dotard is actually an insult that has not been used for a long time. And essentially it is, a dotard is an old person, but more specifically a senile, weak old person. I just love how foreign policy has descended into name calling. I'm really waiting for the your mother jokes to jump in on this. If I want to know what the new argument's going to be, I feel like I should just go to my local school playground and listen to how the kids are talking, because this is almost exactly how I feel with how Kim Jong-un and Trump are going about this. There was an old joke by George Carlin where he talked about war is just a bunch of guys standing in a field waving their pricks at each other. And this is reinforced by how all the bullets and all the bombs are shaped like dicks. I gotta say, in this situation, this really does feel like one situation where it's just one giant prick war. Where Trump and Kim Jong-un are just waving their dicks back and forth trying to see who has the bigger one. But from there, he goes on to then attack Iran. And we got another clip as well for you here. We'll roll that one for you.
We face this decision not only in North Korea. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people. Rather than use its resources to improve Iranian lives, its oil profits go to fund Hezbollah and other terrorists that kill innocent Muslims and attack their peaceful Arab and Israeli neighbors.
So as you can see, he ripped into Iran pretty hard. He talked about, well, their country's values, which without a doubt he's making reference to how the country seems to be a big supporter of radical Islamic ideology. And Trump called him out on him right there. He talked about how they are using their oil profits to fund terrorist groups, especially ones that seem to be operating against Israel, who, well, Iran has called for the destruction of Israel. They have absolutely no love for Israel. So he's absolutely right to do this, although I find it very interesting, too. He goes after the Iran nuclear deal. For those who don't know, it was a deal signed by President Obama during his term that a lot of Republicans didn't like. And essentially, what it did is it unfroze a bunch, billions of dollars of Iranian money that would be returned to them. And in exchange, they were supposed to not pursue a nuclear program. I believe, if I remember the deal correctly as well, that America was allowed access to their facilities to ensure that no nuclear material was being... They weren't trying to... Well, that there was no nuclear material on site. There was nothing to try and make a bomb or anything like that. Now, many were saying that if an agreement was not reached on this subject, that there would have been war between America and Iran. I don't know whether this would have been true, that if an agreement wasn't made, it would have meant that we would have sent in the troops. But it definitely would not have improved relations with Iran. And Iran and America have had shit relations for a long time. Actually, just Iran and the West in general. I can't even just single out America on that one. They probably don't like France, England, or Canada any more than they like America. But after the deal was signed by President Obama, it was all said and done, a group of Republicans got together, and they ended up signing on and sending a message to the Iranian government where they said that this deal is not ground in permanence and that it can be repealed if the next president that was to come in decided to do so. And it was something that they were going to ensure was done if a Republican president got in. Flash forward a couple of years, Trump's in office. However, if you ask me, I'm probably siding with the far lefties on this one, but I gotta admit, this did seem like an act of treason for somebody to do. For the sole fact that the leader of your nation has made a decision and he's made a deal with the government, and then you've gone behind your leader's back and sent a message to that government saying you will not honor that. Especially, well, I doubt they would have really honored it to begin with, but they're definitely not going to honor it. They're going to repeal it when someone they want gets in the office. So what incentive does Iran actually have to then follow this? And then on top of that, all that frozen assets, all those billions of dollars just got funneled back into Iran. So personally, if it was me, even if I was planning on abiding by the treaty and not seeking out nuclear missiles, I think I might change my tune when I get that note. Simply because then I'm like, well, I can't guarantee that they're not going to act against me. Many on the right were already saying, though, that Iran has ripped up just about every single treaty that America has made with them. So that's why they disagreed so vehemently with the Iran nuclear program. That all we did was send billions of dollars into the Iraq government, and we're still allowing them to build the nuclear weapons anyway. So all we've done is hastened it along. So this is why so many Republicans and conservatives are against the Iran nuclear program. So after Iran, he touched really quickly on Syria. He didn't stand too much into it. He criticized Bashar al-Assad, as well as talking about the chemical weapons attack that has happened. I think it was March or April. And then Donald Trump ordered the U.S. Navy to fire something. It was like 59 or 60 Tomahawk missiles that completely obliterated the base. Although it didn't take them long to be back up and running. I think it only took them a couple days. Then he talks about Venezuela, about the problems that have been happened there. And I also covered this in a previous episode. And it just had to do with how the country has descended into a dictatorship, essentially, a socialist dictatorship. And how the people are starving, and how Maduro is not doing his job of looking after his people. And it's without a doubt at least in Venezuela, we've descended into what pretty much seems to be an authoritarian dictatorship. There were reports of how opposition leaders were now starting to get arrested. And there have been videos and pictures coming out of people daily going through heaps of garbage looking for anything to eat or that they can pawn or use just in order to survive. In the past, Trump has threatened military action against Venezuela if they didn't change their tone. And he kind of did again, because he made reference about how further action might be necessary for Venezuela. And he also called for a full restoration of their political freedoms and the democratic process. This is a call that I can completely support. I am with Trump 100% in terms of restoring their democratic process and their freedoms. Okay, so those were the key facts to Trump's speech that he gave at the UN on September 19th. I've already given you a few of the reactions from North Korea, but North Korea then eventually took to the UN stage in order to respond to Donald Trump's comments. And in this, the North Korean representative, he ended up calling out America for their aggressive policies recently. America has made a lot of movements in the South Asian Sea because of what's been going on with North Korea. A few months ago, Trump moved, I think it may have even been the 7th Fleet into that just outside of North Korea, in defense of Japan and South Korea. But he moved a fleet into position. And they're armed, ready to go. They could strike North Korea whenever they want. I don't believe they have been recalled yet, so they've been making reference to this. He also made, I don't know if you want to call it a threat, but he at least made reference that all-out war is possible, that there has not been a peace established between America, South Korea, and North Korea since the Korean War in the 1950s, that they're still on armistice, and that really neither side needs an official declaration of war if they want to start fighting again. Essentially, they could just start shooting off. He ended up even calling the U.S. a constant nuclear threat, which I guess they kind of are. I mean, they do have the most nukes in the world, so they are kind of a constant nuclear threat. But they've always been a deterrent nuclear threat to try and prevent other nations from getting nuclear weapons, because they would need to spend their time working on them, developing them, and in that time America has thousands ready to go on standby. But after taking some shots at America, North Korea then turned to take some shots at the United Nations themselves, such as accusing the UN of covering up for the US and other nations. They made reference to how other nations are also conducting nuclear tests, yet they don't seem to get the same lashback from the UN as North Korea does.
Hans Briggs var det så det kan. Hans Briggs? Oh, no! Oh, hello. Great to see you again, Hans.
Mr. Earl, I was supposed to be allowed to inspect your palace today, and your guards won't let me into certain areas.
Hans, we've been through this a dozen times. I don't have any weapons of mass destruction, okay, Hans?
Then let me look around so I can ease the UN's collective mind.
Hans, you're breaking my balls here, Hans. You're breaking my balls.
I'm sorry, but the UN must be firm with you. Let me see your whole palace, or else.
Or else what?
Or else we will be very, very angry with you. And we will write you a letter telling you how angry we are.
Okay, I'll show you, Hans. You ready?
It's a little bit more understandable, though. They probably don't think so, but at least from an outsider, it's more understandable why there'd be more lashback towards North Korea. For fuck's sakes, they're a crazy goddamn regime. People live in terrible conditions. They're extremely authoritarian, so they can't be too surprised. I don't know if they actually think they have the rest of the world fooled, or whether they just feel they need to keep up this charade for their own people, but I don't even know how many people would be aware of North Korea's representation at the UN that speech even took place. Actually, it may be broadcast around on their propaganda channels simply because it was North Korea making harsh criticisms of the US and the UN and trying to make themselves look good. So actually, maybe it will get broadcasted around. But North Korea has been constantly making threats. I mean, they've threatened South Korea to hit them with nuclear missiles, threatened America. They've made tests just off of Japan. One of their tests actually ended up triggering an earthquake recently. It was their hydrogen bomb test that they did a month or two ago. So I find myself agreeing with Trump when he's talking about how we need to do something about North Korea. I just don't know what could be done. In my previous episode where there was a woman who worked as a... I believe she was a computers teacher, if I remember correctly. Programming teacher or something for North Korea. But anyway, I don't remember exactly what her job was, but she was an outsider that worked. She was a teacher, I know that for a fact. It was either she was teaching them language or she was teaching them about computers. But she was an outsider and she worked there for 3-4 years. And she very quietly and secretly, somehow, some way, managed to gather information on North Korea and escape with it. She gathered it on, I believe she said it was a SIM card and also a couple of USB sticks, and managed to smuggle those out of the country, which was very dangerous because if she had been caught, that she probably would have been thrown in one of their prison camps as a spy, and she'd probably die there. If she wasn't tortured to death, then she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. So she took a big risk to do this. But she seems to feel that the only way things are going to change over there is if people in the West pour information in North Korea. The problem is, too, though, is North Korea has such heavy censorship. There's just so much propaganda over there, and they think that they are the greatest race of people, the greatest nation on the planet. That I don't know if... Well, number one, the problem is getting the information even into the country with so much censorship. But then I just feel like after what, something like 3 generations, maybe 4, of just constant propaganda and brainwashing, could they even have the critical thought to even think the opposite could be the case, that maybe they are not in a good position, that the rest of the world is actually doing better than they are? I just don't know if they could actually accept that. So needless to say, North Korea did not take this speech by Trump well. And they were not alone, actually. Iran was another one who were not very happy with Trump's message. Inside the video of Trump, you could see the Iranian foreign minister as he's sitting there, and throughout the course of the speech, he's progressively getting more pissed off. Especially, there's a good scene of when Trump's talking about Iran, and he does not look happy. Anyway, afterwards, he ended up calling it, quote, an ignorant hate speech that belongs in the medieval times, end quote. And he was not alone. Venezuela's foreign minister also had something to say. He ended up saying, quote, Trump is not the president of the world. He cannot even manage his own government, end quote. Now it's natural that these countries would have a lashback to this. I mean, he called them out directly for their problems. He's called them out directly for their human rights violations. But even with America's allies, it didn't seem to be very well received. The Swedish foreign minister, Margot Wallström, ended up saying that it was the wrong speech at the wrong time to the wrong audience. Personally, my thoughts on this are, well, he says it's the wrong speech at the wrong time to the wrong audience. I feel like there never would have been a good time for a speech like this. Like, I just mean there never would have been a time the UN would be willing to have someone come up so bluntly the way Trump did. What I think Trump did was necessary in this speech, even though it really seemed kind of harsh. Because these are all problems in the past that we've talked about. North Korea, Iran, and now Venezuela. That has more to do with socialism, communism, and the dictatorships that come with it. Don't forget, North Korea itself is a communist dictatorship. Look how they're living. Look how Venezuela's living. So it received a lot of lashback over this. So Trump has received a lot of lashback, sorry. But I feel like it had to be said, and at no point in time would it have been a good point to say. So somebody just had to come up front and do it. And I think that Trump's speech was harsh but necessary. And that moves us into Justin Trudeau's speech at the UN that happened recently. That was actually just the other day. I'm filming this over the course of both the 23rd and the 24th of September, or I should say I'm recording this. So Trudeau's speech happened, I believe, on the 22nd or the 21st, if I remember correctly. And his speech was very, very different to Donald Trump's. You see, Trump focused a lot on foreign policy, but more specifically the problem areas. Syria, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran. Trudeau took a complete 180 on his approach, and he focused completely on Canada. I feel like the perfect UN speech would be a combination of Trump and Trudeau, as in you talk a little bit about your nation, you talk a little bit about foreign policy, considering it's the United Nations, you know? You're kind of updating them on how you're doing and also where the problems in the world that your country sees. But Trudeau, if you ask me, it seemed to me that it was a one big virtue signal. Now, that being said, he did bring up a couple good points that I wanted to highlight and things that I agreed with. But the problem I did have with it is, number one, it was very repetitive. He only touched on a few different subjects, and he kind of touched on them repeatedly. And these are sort of the classic progressive problems: gender equality, indigenous people. In fact, the indigenous affairs was one of his pretty much his main topic. So I ended up listening to the full half an hour speech given by Trudeau. And I was taking my notes as I was listening to it, and pretty much I got a list as we go down of the things he covered. He began by talking about Indigenous affairs and colonialism. Brought up equity and the inequities of the country and the world. He began talking about dignity and respect as a birthright and diversity as a strength. He returned then to speak about Indigenous abuse, such as their history and everything that happened under the residential schools. He moves on to talk about their conditions, how not a lot of Indigenous people have access to water, how they have a high suicide rate, and a lot of children tend to run away. He returns to residential schools, going more directly into it, talking about how it's separating children from their parents. It punishes them for practicing their own culture. Begins talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I've talked about before in the podcast, and that was a commission of people that put together all the human rights violation that Indigenous people in Canada have suffered over the years under the Canadian government. And don't get me wrong, it was a long list. They even said that they believe that at least 6,000 children died in residential schools, but that number could be bigger because records were not kept well in those schools, and many records were destroyed after the schools would close. So to get all the facts is very difficult as to what happened in there. So he was talking about I believe it was 92 or 93 policies that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission brought up is what needed to be changed in order to improve relations between the Canadian government and Indigenous people. Moves on to talk about gender problems, but talking about empowering women and young girls. Talks about poverty in Canada and what they are doing to improve it, including child poverty. He returns to talking about how his government is trying to dismantle the Indigenous affairs. He talked a little bit about climate change, went more into specifics about his tax plan and his plan, which is the improved child benefit payment, and what it's going to do for the Canadian people. Talked about economic trade, such as the Canadian-European Trade Act. Laid out how nations should be concerned in their trade agreements with. They should be concerned with workers' rights, protecting the environment, and also that the benefits of trade should go to a broad audience. And he ended up finishing it off by talking about Indigenous affairs again. Okay. I don't even know how many times in this half an hour speech Justin Trudeau said the words Indigenous.
Indigenous peoples. For First Nations, Métis Nation and Inuit peoples, Indigenous peoples in Canada, Indigenous parents, young Indigenous people in Canada, Indigenous youth, Indigenous women.
I was trying to keep track, and I think I lost track something around 15, 16 before, I don't even know if it was halfway through his speech. So to me, it seemed like a very big virtue signal, though. So that was Justin Trudeau's speech to the UN, and they actually he ended up making a little bit of waves the day or two before, because there was a leadership meeting for members of the UN. And in this meeting, a picture goes viral of Justin Trudeau, who is wearing Chewbacca socks. Yes, Chewbacca from Star Wars. Apparently he was wearing a pair of socks with his business suit. And this sent Google searches off the scale. I think they said they had over 150,000 searches for Chewbacca socks. What I thought was a little bit interesting was what Vanity Fair had to say on this, because they did a bit, we said, an in-depth reading of Justin Trudeau's Chewbacca socks. And essentially, they ended up saying that, quote, namely, this guy knows how to talk about him, and this is one way of controlling the conversation, end quote. Sometimes I wonder if that's true, because there was a clip that came out a few months ago at another world meeting. I think it was maybe it was the G20, I believe, or G7. And Justin Trudeau was just standing around with nobody to talk to, like a young kid in a new class. It's kind of what it looked like. He was just looking around, not sure who to talk to, what to do. So it's quite possible that this is what he was doing, but I don't know. It still seems like Vanity Fair's going a little over the top by saying this was a whole strategy. If you ask me, I don't know. Seems like it was more to do, if anything, I think it had more to do with PR than anything. Make him a little quirky. So one thing that has been getting thrown, though, in Justin Trudeau's face is that this was, in fact, well, I stated that I thought it was a virtue signal, this. I'm apparently not alone, because many people seem to believe this was Justin Trudeau pandering to try and get a seat back on the United Nations Security Council, which will be a possibility in 2021. See, back in 2010, Canada lost its seat on the Security Council underneath the Harper government. And from what I could tell, they said, I think it was because they were taking a very pro-Israel stance. At least that's what the article I found seemed to suggest. But anyway, yeah, so we lost our status back in 2010. And this would allow us to get at least a temporary 2-year seat if we were to get voted in 2021. But one reason I think this is mostly what is happening in Trudeau's speech is him pandering to try and get a seat back on the Security Council is because Justin Trudeau used this to slam Stephen Harper back in the 2015 election run. He made reference to how under Harper's government we lost our seat on the Security Council, and that was a huge loss to the Canadian image, and how we had to do everything in order to get it back. So I think this is Justin Trudeau just trying to do exactly what he said he was going to do. He wants to get our seat back on the Security Council. And what better way to pretty much sit there and shame yourself for the next half hour in your country? Don't get me wrong, there were some good things that Justin Trudeau said, and he had some good points. I mean, talking about Indigenous people, it's very true that many of them live without clean water. It's very true that the women are murdered, and there's so many unsolved cases of children's committing suicide. So these are real problems that got to be addressed. But the problem is that Justin Trudeau has done nothing so far to get into to try and improve relations between Indigenous affairs, at least in my opinion. Because when he ran, he said that he was going to take in all 92 or 93 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's key points in order to rectify the government and Indigenous relationship. He's done very little for them. In fact, I did an episode a while ago where I was talking about this, that so far over the last 2 years, he's done nothing. And recently, this was during when Justin Trudeau did a cabinet shuffle, when he spoke in his speech about how he is dismantling the Indian Act, dismantling Indigenous affairs, because he sees it as a terrible, terrible system. But to me, it seems like he's only started this after about the 2-year mark, and it seems like he's trying to campaign a little bit more. One thing that might actually be playing a factor, I don't know, but I assume, is that the Ontario Liberals are going to the polls eventually. I think in June of 2018. So I think this might also try and help him try and pander and get the Ontario Liberals back in under Kathleen Wynne. This is all just my opinion right now. This is what I think when I look at this and what he's trying to do by dismantling Indigenous affairs and try and repair it, is the fact that he's taken nothing from the Truth and Reconciliation and put it into practice. He's done nothing to try and rectify the situation. He hasn't tried to put fresh water into them or try and get more emergency services to try and help with the suicide rate or the murder rate or any of that. So now he comes out to the UN and he panders about how the Canadian government has failed the Indigenous people. Well, you haven't done anything for them. While I was reading through, I found an article from the Toronto Sun, and it ended up sort of echoing my feelings a little bit on it. But I ended up saying that, start off with a quote by Justin Trudeau that says, "We can't build a better world unless we work together, respect our differences, protect the vulnerable, and stand up to the things that matter most." So this is one thing that Trudeau said in his speech to the UN, and this is actually a great quote. This is one of the quotes I loved. However, the problem is such rhetoric makes for admirable, even self-serving virtue signaling, the sort of stuff the UN loves, but it ignores the ugly and messy reality of history and falsely implied a better future can be found in disapproval of the past. Now, just remember one thing. The last residential school in Canada closed down in, I believe it was 1996 or 97. So all throughout here, from 1968 to 1979 and 1980 through 1984, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, was in office. The residential schools never stopped. This was probably not at their peak, but this was still when a lot of this shit was going on. So now Justin Trudeau is virtue signaling to the rest of us, saying how the government's done nothing. Well, it turns out his father had a big part of that government. He was in it for a long time and could have made changes, and he didn't. And he constantly praises his father. Nothing wrong with praising your father, but it's a situation like this where you're criticizing your own parents, but you won't say it openly. One needs only to look to former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, our current PM's father, for a sorry chapter on Canada's past dealing with First Nations. In 1969, Pierre Trudeau's government issued a white paper proposing to abolish previous legal agreements with Canada's Indigenous peoples, to eliminate Indian status, eradicate treaties, and otherwise assimilate this country's Indian population into the Canadian state. Pierre Trudeau's plan fostered a generation of Aboriginal activism and sparked furious backlash that prompted the senior Trudeau to angrily remark, quote, "We'll keep them in the ghetto as long as they want," end quote. The harsh reality is that the paternalistic model for dealing with the First Nations was costly, bureaucratic, and broken then, and remains the way today. Successive governments have, for the decades, done a far better job for championing good intentions than in making themselves and First Nations accountable for the billions wasted while ordinary First Nation people languish. But the buck stops with the PM. He's in power now. If he wants to help Aboriginal population, as he says he does, and as we encourage him to do, then stop talking and get on with it. Because for me, dismantling the Indigenous affairs, he just put in a couple new positions inside Indigenous affairs. He just pretty much replaced them more than anything. Which he says is going to make things more efficient, but how about we actually start putting money into them? Or, like I've stated earlier, why don't we give them clean water? Why don't we give them access to emergency services instead of just sitting here virtue signaling and say, well, we'll reorganize or dismantle Indigenous affairs? We can do better than that. And the last thing I wanted to talk about when in terms of Trudeau's speech was he made some reference to equity, about wanting an equitable outcome. Equity is a red flag. It should be for everyone. Anybody who talks about equity, they give you a very rose-colored glasses example of equity, which doesn't stand up to what it is in reality. Because equity is different than equality, even if many people might not realize it. And unfortunately, even if you go to the dictionary, it'll talk about how if you look at the definitions, it'll say equity is dealing fairly and equally with all involved, and equality is dealing fairly and equally with all concerned. So there's practically no difference in the definition in the dictionary, but there actually are very two different things. So essentially what equity is, well, let's start with equality. That's the one more people know. So equality is pretty simple. It's equal status, equality of opportunity, that sort of thing. And it ensures that everybody gets the same thing. Not everybody can go out for the same job. Everybody has access to the same benefits, whatever. But then if we come over and we talk about equity, it gives people what they need to enjoy a full life. So this is different rewards for different people, for different groups, which seems fair, but not necessarily. So if we're talking equity in certain ways, it is improved. Like, it is the preferred method. However, when we're talking usually in terms of people, you want to avoid equity as much as possible, and you want to go for equality. So while researching this, one example that people were giving for the difference between equity and equality would be, take a track runner. You got a oval track, and if you have one that is capable of running, let's say like 6-7 runners or something like that, you'll see it in the Olympics and anything else. Generally what they do is anybody on furthest to the outside will start farther ahead than anybody on the inside, and this is supposed to be the fact that the inside track is shorter than the outside track. This is supposed to make up for, it would be unfair otherwise, because then anybody on the outside has to run further in the same amount of time as the person on the inside of the track. So this would be a place where they say, well, equity is what you prefer, because then it actually makes things more fair. Very true. But then if we try and apply equity to more people in a more modern day status, so this usually has to do with opportunity, money, this, that, and the other. Well, one example I heard one time, which I think is the best example for the problems with equity, is this. Imagine you are in school. There are two students there. We'll say, picture yourself, you are the A+ student. You worked hard, you studied, you got your A+ grade. There's another student there who got an F. Now, whatever's going on in their life could be something that needs to be dealt with, for sure. And maybe it puts them at a bit of a disadvantage, but equity would say that the A+ student must lose some of their grade in order to make up for the F student who did not come as high. And if we're looking at all the grades available in between, that would give each one an average of a C+. So that person who worked hard and got that A+ suddenly loses about half of what they just made, while the person who got an F suddenly is brought up. So the difference is equality has a shared burden among all people, while equity has different burdens. Some people share more of the burden while people share less. While this might seem fair, it's not always, because a lot of times equity doesn't take into account why people are in certain situations. Some people are in certain situations because they don't have access to the same opportunity. Sure, that's understandable. Some people are in that situation because they allow themselves to be in that situation, yet for some reason they are required to help out. They are required to not do anything and get reward for it. Because we can look at the F student in this example in two ways. The F student maybe the night before they just found out that their grandfather died, So you're saying, well, come on, that's not fair. Like, the person had a lot going on. They couldn't help that. Well, of course, that's absolutely true. But what if the F student is just somebody who didn't give a fuck and didn't study? Just said, screw it, I want to play my video games, I want to go out with my friends, or whatever, and just didn't study, and they got the F. So that F would be on them, but according to this equity thing, they need to get their grade bumped up to a C+, and that student that worked very hard for that A+, has to get their mark taken away. In exchange, equality would be that everybody earns their own grade. So that would be equality. You study, you do the test, you get your own grade. And I find a lot of times in life, too, you can even look at it the same sort of way what happened in a classroom. Say you're that F student that that's grandfather died the night before, so you couldn't study, you were upset, you couldn't concentrate. The teacher generally will allow you leeway in order for you to make up that test or whatever. A lot of times in life this happens too. If there's something beyond your control, they can't give you all the leeway, but they'll give you some leeway. Like a teacher can't say, okay, take all the time you need, and whenever you're ready, you'll come back and do the test. Usually they say, I understand, if you need a few days, a week, I understand, but then come back and do your test then. It's like they still got to get this done. It's a similar situation I find in life that people handle it. If you are in a dire situation, people will be willing to help you. But if you're not, then if you're not willing to help yourself, then no, why should people help you? So this is my problem with equity, is equity doesn't discriminate in this way. The people who need help and people who just haven't helped themselves get lifted up regardless, and everybody who's worked hard at the top gets taken down a notch. This is why equity should be a red flag. Because equity is not nearly as fair as it sounds. And I'm going to show you one more thing. Many people have probably seen this graphic before. It's the equality versus equity graphic. So if we look at this graphic, we've got three people standing there. We got three varying heights, each one on a box. One of the small one can't see over the fence, and the other two can. And then if we look over the other side, what they say is equity. It's got two boxes for the small one so you can see over, and the tall guy has no box, because that way it seems most fair. There are big problems with this graphic, but it's sort of, I think we can use this as an overlook at the difference, because this is more what it's about. But what this graphic does not take into consideration is exactly what I just talked about, is that some people are in those situations because of lack of opportunity. Some people are in those situations because of their own doing. Now, another good example where maybe equity would be more preferable was an example given in this article I looked at, and they were talking about school funding. So a school that has more low-income communities and people that need more resources, to look at this equally would be that everybody gets the same funding across the board, when maybe certain schools need more funding. For instance, a school for disabled children will need more funding to help them. So this is where maybe an equitable outlook is better. But in general, when we're dealing with people, especially on a social level, you don't want to deal with equity. And for me, I would very skeptical when someone brings up equity. If they can lay out a good argument such as this for the school funding, then sure, you might be able to convince me that in that situation it might be preferable. But on the whole, if anybody just preaches on about equity, make sure you avoid them as much as possible, because they really don't know what they're talking about. A lot of time people that preach equity don't realize that they would be the one that would be torn down a bit in order for somebody else to be brought up, and they say, well, I don't have that much, so why am I being torn down? They say, yeah, but you still have more than this guy. So these were some of my problems with Justin Trudeau, and then again, he had some things that he did pretty well. One quote he made, he was making it more in reference to the indigenous people, but I did like the quote itself, was, maybe good enough just is not good enough. Better is always possible. And I think that's just a great quote for any time. That good enough is not just good enough. Better is always possible. That's a mindset that everybody should adapt. That better is always possible. I find he made some good quotes in this, but all in all, his speech was repetitive and just a lot of virtue signaling about indigenous people. And while the UN did receive it very well, it was not universal across Canadians. Because, in fact, this one, the chair of Indigenous governance at Ryerson University in Toronto, Pam Palmater, said that she wasn't very happy with Trudeau's speech. She said Trudeau talked only of past sins, glossing over the continued shortcomings of his and other governments in meeting the challenges faced by Indigenous people. And she ended up saying, quote, he's trying to save face. He's trying to make sure he gets on the Security Council, end quote. So in the end, this is really what I think Trudeau's speech was all about. It was just about getting back on the Security Council. And that was really it. One thing Trudeau did talk about was his improved child benefits payment. He talked about this, how he was hoping that they had hopes that that they could reduce child poverty by 40% in Canada. And this improved child benefit payment was put in place to replace the Canada Child Tax Benefit, as well as the Universal Child Care Benefit and income splitting. And from what I can tell, it is offering more money to families. See, it's promising that 9 out of 10 families can benefit from this. It's offering, for a family with a child under 6, it's offering them $6,400 per year, which breaks up to about $533 a month. And for parents with child between 6 to 17, they get $5,400 per year, which breaks up to $450 per month. One thing about this is they said that low-income houses will receive more, and if you look on the outline for the improved child benefit payments, it even states the higher your income is, the more and more they take off. So eventually, there'll be a point where you could pretty much see everything disappear off your... You can see everything disappear altogether. Or just about, you really won't get enough to really support you or anything. So this is where I think this child benefit payment falls short, is that if you make enough, there's no point to even applying for it, for the sole fact that even if you would be allowed to it doesn't give you anything worth helping you throughout the month. So that was what's being offered by improved child benefit payment, and this contrasts to the universal child care benefit, which only offered $1,200 per year, which was $100 a month for children under 6. That was original, and then they ended up bumping it up to that was the original, and then they ended up bumping it up to $1,920 a year, which brought it up to $160 per month for children under 6, and also $720 a year, $60 a month for children between 6 and 17. And it was said about 4 million families were expected to benefit from this. The requirements to get into Trudeau's new plan, the improved child benefit payment, is pretty light. You usually just have to give your income, number of children. More or less, that's it. Where it seemed like the other benefit packages that it's replacing were a lot more, they were more in depth, and it was a lot harder to actually get the benefits you were hoping for. Okay. And the last thing discussing Trudeau's speech to the UN is Trudeau, before he went there, he spoke about how one thing he wanted to talk about was the Myanmar crisis. And the crisis is that Myanmar Buddhists are currently targeting, they are the Rohingya Muslims, and they've been committing acts of genocide against them. And this has caused a lot of them to flee. So Trudeau said he wanted to talk about this, and I think it may have come up a little bit in like the leaders meeting that happened a few days before Trudeau's speech, but he completely forgot to mention this on the world stage of the UN. So to me, this kind of seems like a big no-no. I mean, maybe not. He focused completely on Canada, but he didn't mention it, so I thought that was a kind of a faux pas on his part. All right, moving on from the UN, Milo Yiannopoulos is back in the news lately, and it turns out that Milo wishes to have a free speech rally. Well, I shouldn't say wishes. The free speech rally was supposed to happen today, but there was a lot of controversy surrounding it. See, all right, going back, so this event was set up by Milo Yiannopoulos and also by a Berkeley student group called the Berkeley Patriots. And they were trying to have an official Berkeley campus rally in Sproul Plaza. Milo had talked that he had many key figures set up to speak from the rights. A couple that he had made reference to were Ann Coulter, Steve Bannon. Those were just to name a few more. But there was a few other invitations, such as Michael Malice, Douglas Murray, and James Damore, the author of the Google memo. But this ended up hitting a wall early on because, well, one problem that ended up happening was that people who were supposed to be scheduled to come were saying that they had not received invitations. And this actually is extended to Douglas Murray, Michael Malice, and James Damore. They all said that they had no idea that they were supposed to speak at this Berkeley Free Speech announcement. Others also include Dave Horowitz, Breitbart contributor Ariana Rollins. But yeah, they said they had no idea about this. In fact, Ann Coulter herself said, quote, "I never planned to speak." And she said that to the Los Angeles Times. "My speaker bureau never booked me to speak at Berkeley. No contract for me to speak existed," end quote. And then one other member is Lucian Wintrich. He's from Gateway Pundit, a right-wing site. And he said he was a scheduled speaker, but he ended up mentioning to the Guardian that he knew at least a week ago that the event wouldn't proceed. He ended up saying, quote, "The entire thing is a complete disaster and unfortunately it makes us all look very unprofessional. It was completely mismanaged and they could have told people earlier this week it wasn't happening rather than waiting until the last moment. Obviously, if the organizers of an event don't actually organize an event, then the event won't happen," end quote. So his quote there at the end, he says, wait, they should have canceled rather than waiting until the last minute. This is because just yesterday, so it looked to be just yesterday, the 23rd, the day before the rally was supposed to start, Milo Yiannopoulos ended up having a press conference in which he said that the event has been canceled. And he said that because it has been canceled, he is going to go and have an unofficial free speech rally. And that even if it's not condoned by the Berkeley campus, and unfortunately for him, that the Berkeley Patriots had to pull their support from Milo. So without student support, he couldn't have an official event. So he said he was going, come hell or high water, he was going to have his event on Berkeley. So now accusations are getting hurled both ways on this. Some have accused Milo of not planning of ever having the event and was hoping to more come out as sort of a conservative martyr in this, in that the campus would shut it down and once again he could look like the victim. Milo, on the other hand, is accusing that they were trying to be railroaded right off the start. That the student group was given lots of paperwork to fill out and they were trying to be drowned in bureaucracy. So that way, if the event didn't take place, the school could then claim that Milo and his associates didn't fill out the appropriate paperwork, and that way resolve them of any accusations of trying to shut the Free Speech Week down. That being said, the university has shot back saying that the organizers missed several key deadlines, such as securing the venue and also confirming the guest list. So this almost, for me, seems to be the case. I don't know for a fact, but just from what I've seen, it seems to be that case, because a lot of speakers are saying they didn't even know that they were invited to this. So upon hearing the cancellation, Antifa did pretty much a victory march in the streets. But it seemed to me it was a little too early for them to be making a victory march, because the unofficial rally did take place today in Berkeley. It took place at noon their time. I'm on the Eastern timeline, so I believe they're 3 hours behind me. So the counter-protesters ended up setting up a No Hate in the Bay march against white supremacy as their counter-protest in order to rally people behind their cause. Antifa was present in this, but more specifically, it is the By Any Means Necessary and Refuse Fascism groups. And they were there with their masks. But the cops seemed to be out in force this time, and they were avoiding any real conflict from happening. So Tim Pool was on the scene during this rally today. Tim Pool is an independent journalist, someone I actually really respect and I turn to if I want my news. But anyway, so he was doing a live stream today of the rally, and from going through the videos, you can see that it seemed to be not as violent as people were expecting. A lot of people were expecting to turn out sort of like how it has in maybe Charlottesville or even in Berkeley back in February in the 3 battles at Berkeley. But more or less, it started off with just the counter-protesters, doing all their chants, and they took to the megaphones in order to preach their message about no Trump, no hating. There were chants going all around of no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA. That's pretty much their classic chant in any of these. That seems to be all they can ever do. There were heated debates all around, but it seemed like the cops were stepping in before anything got too out of hand. There was a little bit of pushing and shoving, but I didn't even think I saw a punch getting thrown. I could be wrong on that, but I don't believe I even saw a punch get thrown, so that was kind of good. A few people were arrested. At least I should say I didn't see any punch getting thrown that was on this live cast by Tim Pool. Maybe somewhere else they did. And the numbers were actually much smaller this year than they were expecting. This is probably due to the cancellation. But even so, there was still, probably there was 100 people allowed on Sproul Plaza, and there was probably at least a few hundred other people that had gathered down outside of the plaza just doing their own protest there. Some of them were counter protests, some of them were pro-Trump people, but all in all, despite a few hundred people being present, there didn't seem to be much in the way of violence. One thing I think that is important for this is Tim Pool actually ended up doing an interview with Mike Cernovich. Now, Mike Cernovich is well known as a contributor to InfoWars, and he's a friend of Milo Yiannopoulos. So he helped him set up this free speech rally, this free speech week. So Tim Pool caught him the day before the rally on I believe it was the 23rd. Yeah, the 23rd of September. And so when doing an interview, they were talking about everything that went down with Berkeley so far. And he said that so in terms of this accusations that Milo never wanted this to go through, Mike Cernovich claimed that Milo had gotten in touch with him months ago about this, and he actually had to move some family shit around in order to make everything work and to come down, so he doesn't believe for a minute that Milo was hoping that this didn't happen. However, he was very upfront in saying that they, essentially Milo and the rest of them, the worst thing that could have happened for them was if Berkeley cooperated with them, saying that the stonewalling and everything that happened is what's really given them their meat for their rally, that if things went off without a hitch, then they wouldn't get the attention they need. Essentially what he said is their perfect scenario would be Berkeley stonewalling their free speech week, but it continuing on for the full 4 days, and for Antifa and their groups to show up but not hurt anybody, so that way they can make themselves look like idiots without actually causing any violence. So he was pretty upfront about this. Pretty much Milo, Mike Cernovich, and them, it was a very provocative move. They chose Berkeley intentionally for the sake of how provocative it would be. Milo eventually shows up to the rally, and he gets surrounded by, the media and everybody off the bat. They start making their screams. The counter-protesters start doing their screams at him. But the event didn't seem to last long today. It seemed that things were only lasted for a few minutes at best. They said Milo came out, he gave his speech a little bit, took a few selfies, but then was pretty quickly escorted off. So this whole 4-day free speech week didn't seem to turn out to be much. I mean, we'll have to check out over the next few days to be sure. They said that it's supposed to run till the 27th. So we'll see if anything else actually happens from this rally. But it seems like it's more or less dead. It seems like even day one, he shows up, they're barely there, and they leave. Few people show up. A few hundred people show up, scream at each other, and it doesn't seem to progress more than there. It was kind of interesting because, along with Tim Pool, both the YouTubers Sargon of Akkad and Lauren Southern were there, and you can go check out. Lauren Southern ended up doing an interview with Sargon of Akkad. So did Tim Pool the day before. He ended up doing an interview. I'll link both of those in the descriptions. And you can also check out, in the descriptions, I'll have Trudeau's speech, I'll have Trump's speech, and I'll also have the North Koreans' response to Trump's speech. But I think that's all I got for you today. I want to thank you for joining me on the podcast today. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is just my stupid opinion. I'll see you soon.
You profit from